We had in February on our first Wednesday's conversations, our conference-wide Zooms once a month, we'd had the Reverend Dr. Bill Lyons with the Southwest Conference come and speak to us about that messy relationship, right, between the pastor being an employee and the pastor being a spiritual leader of a congregation and what that meant. And Bill gave a very wonderful conversation for us that day. If you could find that up on our conference website, if you want to go and review that particular conversation. Out of that conversation, we heard a number of people. For us, a number of people is anywhere from 3 to 5 to 6 people asking about pastor reviews and how to go about them, particularly in light of that conversation we had just had. Are you reviewing an employee? Are you reviewing a spiritual leader? How do you do this in a way that is honoring of all that a pastor position kind of encompasses, right? My goal was to have a good friend of mine, and I'll speak about him later, do a better introduction about him, Rob Boyle, who has developed mutual ministry valuations to come and lead us through an orientation to mutual ministry valuations. In conversations with Rob, he rightfully indicated we also need to have conversations on what it means to create cultures of excellence in our churches. And I'll dive into what some of that, I'll unpack some of that as we get into this. And since we are on a limited budget in comparison to past budgets of the conference, we couldn't really afford for him to do both. So the decision was made that I would move forward with the ministry, mutual ministry review information, and Rob will come in and join us at a later date around creating cultures of excellence. So some of the questions that might be raised here tonight, I may not be able to answer. I'm going to just state that up forward, but I'm hoping that we'll get Rob in to answer those questions, and I think he'll be a great follow-up for some of the things we're setting up tonight. You were sent a document along with this. I hope you have that document in front of you somehow, because I won't be referring to it directly, but from time to time, I will be notating what page we're on because of the information that's on that particular page. You will note that the second half of that document looks really spiffy. That was the planned portion when I thought we would be 20 people. And then as the numbers went up, I thought, oh, we need some information on what I consider introductory material. So that got added later. And you will notice that that is not as grammatically nice as the later document. So later half of that document. So the first half was added very recently. It didn't have a chance to go through the eyes of Dorothy, who's a wonderful editor, where the second half did. I know that. I know there are grammar mistakes, there are typos. So don't worry about those. If that's the biggest thing you're leaving this conversation with, then may I suggest you leave the conversation now, because there are more significant things for us to talk about. And that's what I'm going to be putting my focus on and our focus on for this evening. So I please appreciate your concern, but I do know they're there, and we're going to pretend that they're not there. And should I do this again, we'll correct those, make those corrections at that time. Our time together this evening falls into 3 acts. I know you didn't know you were coming for theater, but here you are, and you're the players. Woo, that's exciting. Act 1 is talking story about church culture. That's that background I need to set in order for us to understand what mutual ministry reviews really are about and how they function. Heads up on this one, our theme is going to be, does our congregation focus on culpability, or does our congregation focus on creativity? That will be our theme. Following Act 1, we'll have a little intermission, so if we need just to take a break, you can do so, and then we'll come back. Act 2 will be a walk through the mutual ministry review template. That is the second half of the packet that was sent out, along with Act 3, which is a walk through what's called a conduct accountability process, because there are times when the mutual ministry review isn't appropriate. And this is something that can be used during those times, although we will look in actually when there's a time when this isn't appropriate either. But these are our tools for your toolbox, and they kind of go one with the other, so we're presenting them together. So that's our time for this evening. The logistics are, as I have said, I had kind of conceptualized this as sitting around and having a fireside chat and just talking story with 20 people. We are way beyond that and what that means for us. And so there are times when I'm hoping I'll remember to stop and ask for questions. I will say, hey, unmute yourself. I'm going to ask for a question. So if you do have a question, you're ready to do that and you're unmuted. You are spread over 4 screens on my computer, so I know I won't see you if you raise your hand. I'm asking you to shout out your question. It's okay if we talk over each other. We'll figure out who goes first, who goes second. That was part of, right, the cacophony of what we're heading to, Pentecost. So that's okay here. If you have a question and I didn't hear you, and you really do want an answer, and I really do want to address your questions, please type that in the chat. Of Lori and Dorothy are watching the chat for me, and they have permission to break in with those questions. So if for some reason your question didn't get picked up, just type it in the chat and we'll give you there. I'm asking, I know that some of us are a little more braver in asking questions, and some of us are a little more reticent. So I'm asking, if you have asked a question at an earlier question time, that you might either type your next question in chat or hold off to see if other people have questions before asking yours, so we can make sure that everybody gets a chance to address the particular issues that they bring into this conversation. So that is, that's kind of our logistics for this evening. Before I forget, this material and this workshop is made possible because of your contribution to our church's wider mission and the Friends of the Conference Fund. So thank you. I know a bunch of you gathered here are contributor to both of those streams of revenues for the conference. And so thank you for that. That makes this type of conversation appropriate and available to you all. I have asked Kahu Kimberly Fong to open us in prayer. So Kimberly, if you will bring us into the presence of God.
Let us take a moment of a deep breath and inviting the Spirit of the living God. In your presence, O God, we come to you, seek your wisdom, your guidance, what it means to be an authorized minister or to have authorized minister in our midst. We need your help. May your Spirit descend upon us, illumine our hearts and minds and our souls to hear your voice, to hear your wisdom. Shine your light upon our pathways so that we can uphold your high calling. As your people, as the followers of Jesus Christ, may we humbly walk with you, following the footsteps of our Lord Jesus. May we be the agents of bringing your love, your justice, peace, your joy, and your grace. Lord God, bless us in everything we do. Bring glory to you. And you'll be in charge of this meeting and guide us with your Spirit. In Jesus' name, all God's people say, Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Kimberly, for that prayer. So here's a time to unmute your mics if you would like. And the question simply is, why are you here?
This is Kyle. I'm here because I had an absolutely horrible, let's see, what was the name of that church? First Church UCC experience, a mutual ministry review, and I am really excited about learning that there is another way.
Thank you, Kyle. Others?
This is Woody. We are soon embarking on a review of our pastor. A little overdue, we have to admit. And this will help us kind of give us good perspective on how to proceed.
Thank you, Woody. One or two more?
My name is Kailani Hess from Kwai Hao Church, and we've just gone through a pastor's review. And so this is hopefully will be confirmation.
Thank you.
This is
Somebody
Tino.
else? Yes, Tino.
In my experience so far, in some of my other churches, they treat the pastor as an employee. And so they run their church as a business and seem to want to satisfy Caesar. And then there are other churches that look at the pastor as a spiritual leader, run their church as a church, and look to God for guidance and not Caesar.
Thank you, Tino. Some of the things raised here really are going to be better off handled in the training or the orientation with Rob Voyle on cultures of excellence, these broader conversations, right? How do we run a church? How do we conceptualize church? Things of that nature. But I appreciate everything that was said here because it shows kind of the wide variety that we bring into this conversation. We bring pain, we bring concern that we've done something correctly, we bring hope that we'll do something correctly, or at least not as fumbling as sometimes it could happen. And we bring ideas of how do people understand the church and what the church is about, what is appropriate and when is that appropriate. All of that comes into this and more for those who just answered the question in their heads and didn't get a chance to share. You bring that with you too. I have one objective that I hope you will leave with tonight. This objective is mine objective, and so it may not play out for you, but I'm going to put it on you because I can do that. And that is, I want to personally move you beyond a framework that considers reviews as tools for assigning culpability for when things go wrong, and to move you to a framework of understanding that reviews can be a point of creativity, resilience, and adaptiveness. But that's the point of creativity. And part of our problem here is that the church in the U.S. at this time is a very anxious system or anxious organization. We are not the church of the 1950s. We tend to look back to that as the golden age because everything was working and people were coming to church and we didn't have to work hard to get them to church. And Christianity, to be honest, reigned supreme. And if you were another religion, you were poo-pooed and all of this stuff. Whether we agree with that or not, right, we still look to the 1950s as the high mark of the church. And we're not there. We live a very different stories. People are not busting our walls, our doors down to get in. If anything, we're sitting with empty pews, and we're very anxious about that. We're seeing the UCC closes a church every week and a half. We birth a church every 5 weeks. So the statistics tell us we ain't doing well. And we live in that anxiety of that narrative because that narrative comes to us out of the 1950s. If your church is dying, you ain't doing well. The reality is that the society has changed, and what it asks from the church has changed, and we're still trying to figure out what it is they're asking from us and what it means to be relevant. We're going to get that figured out. There are some brilliant minds out there, and we got plans here within the conference around the Innovation and Engagement Initiative that will allow us to get in front of that 8th ball instead of behind it. But we're not there yet. And because of that anxiety, we lean toward punishment. Pastor, we have no youth in our church and it's your fault. Pastor, our giving's down and it's your fault. Pastor, the women's group can't go on anymore because we're all 80 plus years old, and so we're going to let it go, but it's your fault. I hear that because in the past, the pastor had some modest control over that, not a lot. We'll delve into that, but now there's no control over that. Why? Because the role of the pastor has itself shifted. In the 1950s and on up, the pastor was the CEO of the congregation. That was the role of the pastor. Now the role of the pastor is to be the entrepreneurial mind of the congregation. Well, what the heck does entrepreneurship have to do with the church? Well, it has everything from funding to imaginative ministries and things of that nature. But you can't do that out of a CEO model, which is, if you were in seminary probably up until the early 2010s, was the model you were taught about being a pastor, because the new models hadn't emerged yet for us to hang on to. So pastors, we're an anxious bunch. When we delve into the 1950s church, and I'm going to pick on youth ministry, is that we find out is that really the pastor didn't have a lot to do with youth ministry. It was the beloved Sunday school teacher or the beloved youth minister, right? The Pied Piper that the kids, the Keiki, and the youth loved to hang around. That's what made for great youth ministry. And we had churches that had the finances to afford those people. We no longer have the finances to afford those people, so we no longer have those people. And guess what? Children and youth no longer hang around. That's part of the shift. That's part of our anxiety. The reality of the church for us today is that we're a fearful lot. And because of that, we're looking to assign blame as to whose fault it is. Because, and this is where poor spirituality plays in for us, because we don't want to be seen as failing in the eyes of God. Now, I want to hang on to that. I think that's a nice motivation. I don't want to fail in the eyes of God too. But here's where poor spirituality comes in. God is gracious, and that we know from the life and the teachings of Jesus, in the ministry of Jesus among us. But we act as if God punishes us. And to be honest, that gets us into poor Calvinism, but I'll leave Calvinism out of this because we're not here to discuss theology. But that, to me, is the crux of our problems. And so that's why we need to shift our focus. This is part of shifting our focus, is shifting culture within our congregations. That's the first half of what we're going to walk through tonight, is this cultural shift. Blame and shame lead to culpability. Grace and compassion lead to creativity. And that we need to keep in front of us. And we'll explore that a bit more. Right now, I want to go back, not go back, but I want to step back just a little bit from this kind of hard discussion to something that Dr. Jeffrey Aceto, who's a member of Pearl City Community Church, has taught me is very important. He has taught me that whenever we gather, we need to give our name, home, and ancestor that comes with us into this conversation. I wish we had time to do that for everybody gathered here. We don't. And so what I'm going to do is give mine, to this as well, and invite you to think of what your name, home, and ancestor that you bring into this. So you know me, I'm David Popham. I'm the conference minister for the Hawaii Conference. What's the Hawaii Conference? It's 116 congregations formed together in 5 associations, celebrating an incredibly wide diversity of ethnic backgrounds and the beauty that brings in, and the tension that sometimes that brings in, and with a legacy that both has some great things to celebrate and some gnarly things we've still got to work out because they still tie us in knots. That's the Hawaii Conference. I come to you tonight, the home that I come from, right? I've been a local church pastor for 11 years. So I bring that with me to be on that end, the receiving end of a pastoral review. As a conference employee, which I've been an employee of a conference for, 14, 15 years now, that means in my local church, I'm a church member. So I've been on that side of the equation too, when church members have questions for the pastor, trying to figure out how to help this relationship work, if it's stumbling, or how to make it better, if it's a great relationship. And of course, I come to you as a church leader, one who has the luxury and gets paid to sit back and think through what does it mean for us to be in life and covenant with one another, and hold that covenant gently, where we hold each other accountable and make each other creative as well. So that's kind of the home I come from. That's what I bring to you in this conversation. The ancestor I bring with me, I've already introduced a bit, is Reverend Dr. Rob Boyle. He's the executive director of the Clergy Leadership Institute and developer of the Appreciative Way. I've had a series of extended trainings with Dr. Boyle and have used him as an executive coach as well. The Appreciative Way that he's developed is a blend of appreciative inquiry, positive psychology, and compassion as understood in both Christian and Buddhist traditions. I noticed in the chat that somebody asked about the Buddhist side of that. You'll need to talk to Rob Boyle about that. I'm not here to unpack that. I'm just here to let you know what's the background of the Appreciative Way and what I'm going to take out of that. So let me unpack some of these labels, because the concepts they point to are important for the rest of our conversation. I want to make sure we're all interpreting the words in the same way, because sometimes I hear one word and I hear one thing, somebody else hears the same word, they hear another thing. So appreciative inquiry means to inquire, or to analyze, or to probe, or to examine, or to review an organization from the point of view of its strengths. That's the appreciative part. We look at an organization such as a church, an association, a conference, from its strengths and not from its weaknesses. So hear that typically most reviews revolve around the weaknesses, and we'll delve into that a little bit more. We do this, what appreciative inquiry has demonstrated to us is that when we inquire from strength, studies have shown that you make people who compose the organization more creative, more resilient, and more adaptive. David Cooper Ryder, the person who developed appreciative inquiry, did this when he was doing his doctoral work. He was working with the Mayo Clinic in Cleveland, and he's an organization specialist. That is, I forget what that field is called. Hopefully somebody here knows, and you could put it in the chat for us. But he was working with Mayo Clinic. He was doing an examination of the clinic. And he realized that as he talked to nurses and doctors and technicians, as he talked to janitors and administrators, that whenever they talked about the strengths of the organizations, they were opened up, they were relaxed, they were talking about the future and what they wanted to see the organization do in the future. When they talked to that, they got to that part of the interview where they talked about the weaknesses, they closed down, They were guarded. It was about the past. Nothing was said about the future. And so that is where appreciative inquiry comes out of, that type of approach. There's a story that Rob shares, and so I'm going to just steal it from him. Rob is also a priest in the Episcopal Church, and he was called in by another Episcopal church. We're shrinking, right? We've heard this story. We're shrinking. We don't have enough volunteers to do all the positions that we need to do. So we want you to come and help us to figure out how to excite people to be volunteers for us. So Rob goes, he sits down with the council or session of the Episcopal Church, and he says, so tell me your story. And it's right, it's the story I have been guilty of saying. We're small, we can't do anything. This sucks, that sucks, the youth had gone, everybody's getting older, we don't have the volunteers. And Rob says, because he's prodding for strength, right? So he says, so tell me, did you all worship this past Sunday? Oh, yeah, we worshiped. Well, there's the strength of the church. There was enough energy for them to worship. Well, tell me, what was the highlight of the worship? Oh, well, that is communion for us. And let us tell you why. We have the most beautiful communion table that is done up. Well, who does up the communion table? Oh, that's Hilda. Hilda does up the communion table. She's been doing it for years. We don't even have to worry about it. Oh, well, let's go find Hilda and find out what makes doing the communion table so exciting for her. So they get a hold of Hilda, they bring her into the meeting, and Rob says, Hilda, tell me what you do for Sunday worship in the communion table. And Hilda says, I've got the best job in the church. I get to set the table for the meal between God and God's children. So Rob turns to the leadership, the bleak leadership of the church, and says, you don't need more volunteers. You need more Hildas. People who understand, right, that they have the most exciting job in the life of the church. So that's appreciative inquiry. It approaches from an organization's strengths, and that's why it approaches from the strengths. Because guess what? You're not going to get more worn out volunteers to volunteer more heavily. But you can create people excited about the job they do, and hopefully that will catch on to others, right? So when you probe from weaknesses, again, people become closed off. They become paranoid and embarrassed and shameful. And studies have shown that shame is the key factor, by the way, for shutting people down. And when we shut people down, they become unimaginative, unresponsive, and even defeatist, the exact opposite of what we want to do with a review, right? And my own offspring, Jenna, or younger offspring, has started a job. And I saw this play out in the first 2 weeks on the job, where the person who hired her and she's responsible to was not the person training her. That had been left to somebody else. And this other person just knew how to give negative feedback. You're too slow. This isn't right. You need to do this. Do this. Oh, you don't know how to do that? Well, why didn't you ask the question about how to do that before I told you to do it? Within 2 weeks, Jenna was ready to quit. And so mom and dad had to say, well, why don't you talk to the person who is your supervisor, see how you're doing. And so she did, and the supervisor said, don't worry about that. In my eyes, you're doing a fabulous job, and you'll learn to get a little quicker as this becomes habit for you and stuff like that. It was night and day, right? Jenna was ready to quit one day, and the next day she felt like she was contributing in a positive way to the life of the company she works with. What a difference that is. So that's appreciative inquiry. That's what it means to inquire from an appreciative point of view. Positive psychology kind of gets a bum rap because we think it means to think positive. positively about everything. That's not true. That's denial, not positive psychology. In a nutshell, positive psychology is to what's the word that I'm looking for? It's to I don't want to use the word appreciative because we just talked about appreciative inquiry, but is to approach people from what is positive in their life and the strengths around that positivity to help grow that. And so think of positive psychologists such as Eric Erickson, not the famous developmental psychologist, but a little less famous psychologist out of Utah, Mark Andreas, who was in Colorado, and others of the ilk who understand that the resources to live meaningful lives already exist within us, and we access those resources when we are in a positive state of being. Their studies have shown this to be true. There's a famous study that's been reproduced and repeated now with the same results over a number of periods, where on a college campus, students were brought in to do a task. And the task, it was a test type task. The test was you to be shown a picture and then you would be shown a word, and you had to, a yes or no button is what you had to press. And the yes or no was, does the picture and the word, are they the same thing? So you might see a basketball and see the word basketball, you would press yes. You might see an eyeball and see the word bird, and you would press no. Those are not the same thing. What they did was to prime the students taking the test. So some students were given a positive prime. Wow, that's a great haircut you got. Wow, I like your shoes. Wow, don't you look great today? Something of that nature, right? Just something positive that was said to them as they entered the room to take the test. Some students, nothing was said to. Thank you for coming here, enter the room, here's the test. Some students received a negative prime, right? Oh, what happened to your hair today? Or, dude, really? Is that what you wear? That's not very professional looking. Or whatever the negative primes were. Over and over again, it was shown that people with the positive primes, they not only did better than the people with the negative primes, better being they answered more accurately and at a faster speed than people with the negative primes, they did people in the neutral primes that had no primes at all. They did better than those people. And of course, those who received that little negative prime, they did worse, right? Because that's their ability to access the creativity part of the creative part of themselves, the smart part of themselves that have been thrown into doubt by the negative prime. So that's what positive psychology is about. How do we access that area of ourselves that when we talk about being in the zone, how do we access that area of our life? Appreciative Way then brings two assumptions that underlie everything we're going to do this afternoon and early evening. And if you disagree with them, that's fine. However, I'm telling you now, that's what underlines everything that's moving forward. And that is that the person is doing their best, the best that they can at any given situation. That does not mean there's not room for improvement, but in that situation, at that time, they're doing the best they know how to do to handle that situation. Some of you have undoubtedly heard me say, we do the best we can until we learn better, then we do better. I really imbibe this piece of Appreciative Way. And then the other thing that comes out of the Appreciative Way that underlines our time this evening is shame leads to blame and blame shuts us down. You've already heard me give the case for that, and I'll keep reminding us of that. Because most of the time, my fear is because of the anxiety within our congregations and that fear of not measuring up to the standards of God, we look to blame others. We're kind of caught in the Adam and Eve and snake syndrome, right? It wasn't us, it was the snake, right? That's kind of, and I want us to move out of that. God has already made amends for Adam and Eve, and we don't have to relive that over and over and over again. So these are the ancestral voices I bring with me and will continue to engage throughout our conversation. Get ready and unmute yourself once again, because here's the question, and it's the question behind every question. Why do a review? For what purpose do we do reviews?
Make sure we're on the same page.
Excellent, to make sure we're on the same page, absolutely, to check in there, and that becomes important for what some of the stuff we'll discuss this evening as well. Others?
To improve ourselves.
For the purpose of improving ourselves. Oh, I love this. These are all the great reasons to do a review. Others?
If the congregation and the pastor are in mutual ministry, you look for mutual growth.
Absolutely, yes, because you would assume that in mutual ministry, that growth is happening together and not one or the other or in separate ways. Thank you. One more person, if they would like.
Open communication on self-care.
Amen. Thank you for that one. Open communications on self-care. These are all of the real reasons we need to be doing reviews to engage in, right? To make sure we're on the same page and we're not working in ways that trip each other up, to become a better person at what I do in my job, and to make sure that I'm hearing back those critiques that I need to hear, right, that help me improve myself, to make sure that we're being able to talk about our self-care. Now that part of review often gets locked off because the review tends to go the typical review, right, goes one way from the congregation to the pastor, and rare is it the review that includes the pastor back to the congregations or the representatives of the congregation. So, but that's still a great thing. Lines of communications, right? Because we all know that when we're not communicating, things go bad really quickly. So these are wonderful reasons to do reviews. We tend to see reviews as feedback, and I'm going to push that feedback is not as great a thing as we want or we think it is. And then we'll talk about feed forward. And I'm not sure what pages those are in the document sent out, but if you want to look for a little more about that, you'll find this in those documents. Rob Voyle, as I've already said, he's an executive coach as well, and at one time taught at the College of Executive Coaches. And he shared an experience there asking other executive coaches what the purpose of feedback was, right? These are people who are paid high dollars to increase performances for CEOs and these top officials, right? Or if you happen to have the money to afford the person yourself for your own benefits as well. Rob said, majority of the coaches replied that people need feedback to know what? You can already guess this, to know when they are failing and they're not doing it right. That old culpability model is truly ingrained within us, particularly in the US culture. On rare occasions, a few coaches would report that people also needed to know when they had been successful. So there's some positiveness in that feedback. I agree with that, no problem there. According to Rob, eventually someone would finally indicate that feedback was necessary so that people could improve their performance in the future. Here's what you need to know about this project, so the next time you work on something like this project, your performance for doing that is improved. Rob is fond of reminding those he trains that since we will spend the rest of our lives in the future, it makes sense that we want to develop ways of improving our future performance. So what is then, so that's the failure of feedback, according to Rob. I'm not going to mix these words up. I'm just giving you kind of his piece here. That's the failure of feedback. What is the most common form of systematized feedback in a work setting? The annual performance review, right? And so I want you to think of a time when you received a review, or maybe the last review you received. And I want you to answer this question. Did that review leave you feeling energized, resourceful, and creative? Or did it leave you feeling a bit frustrated? And you don't have to answer that out loud. I just want you to think that through. How did that review feel for you, and how did it handle for you? Rob would say that feedback is ineffective in achieving the desired goal of improving future performance. Why? Because it simply looks at the past and it never asks questions about the future, because the review is already biased toward blame. This didn't go right. It's your fault. The review is already biased toward blame. Rob estimates that less than 10% of annual reviews actually inspire, motivate, and equip people to do more, to do a more effective job at what we have hired them to do. So please be aware of that. So if feedback is not what we are doing, then what are we hoping to seek out of a review? Well, the renowned executive coach, Marshall Goldsmith, reported a similar finding to that of Rob regarding the ineffectiveness of feedback for improving future performances. Goldsmith found that what was helpful and effective is what he termed feed forward. Now, I'm not going to miss these words. If you still want to call it feedback, that's fine. But understand the difference between looking at the past and looking toward the future. Feed forward is advice on what to do differently in the future to improve future performance, whether that future is next month, next year, or the next 5 years, whatever you're shooting for. I've had the experience in the past year and a half of entering the Hawaii Conference office. And I enter it not only as an employee, but somehow as a supervisor of the Hawaii Conference staff. And I come in with this kind of appreciative way under my belt and in my mind and in my thinking. And I enter a conference office that lived or imbibes in a different culture from time to time. So you can imagine what it's like for us to get our stride together, right? When something happens, I'm going, oh, that doesn't make me feel well. What do I say to the staff? Well, I could say, dang it, that doesn't make me feel well. That's not who I am. That's not what I want to be about as a conference minister. You can do it this way, or it's the highway, which probably would cause a lot of people to get upset, rightfully so, and leave, because it's not my office, right? It's the conference office. And they've been in this conference office and a part of it much longer than I have. Or, as I have done, I could come in and say, you know, this happened. It's not really what I particularly care for. In the future, I would prefer this. And so we've already set it up for a performance, a different performance in the future around those type of things that pop up. And part of it is just learning that from one another. The office has had the same thing to me. David, you want to do it this way, and that's grand and beautiful, but you got to know the culture you're in. And this is how you need to do this moving forward. And I do appreciate that type of input, and I invite that type of input from the conference staff. So far, it's worked out. We'll keep our fingers crossed, right, as we continue living together. So as we're accessing feed forward, that is the key to the mutual ministry review template we're going to walk through, right? That's the key. Improving future performance and celebrating that as opposed to punishing past actions. So please be aware that that's the key that I'm going to kind of drill down on. Right now, I want you to think of a time when you had to give someone, and hear the word, I'm saying this on purpose. I want you to think of a time when you had to give someone in your family, in the church, in your workplace, out on the street, wherever, but you had to give someone negative feedback. I want you to think of that. I want you to picture that in your head. Have that there. I know it could be a little painful to do that. You're not asked to share that out loud, but just kind of hold that in your consciousness, that particular event, when you had to give someone negative feedback. Hold that in your head, because I want to walk through the process of negative feedback. Negative feedback usually follows this line. It's unconscious in us, but this is normally what we do. We observe a performance. We evaluate the performance as not living up to whatever standards we have. And then we approach the performance with contempt. So that when we approach the individual who did whatever it is we're critiquing, we approach that person with contempt. And I've seen this play out over and over and over again in pastoral reviews. And I'm doing my best not to mention any congregation here in Hawaii, but congregations from other places I have been. But so that's what I say. I've seen that over and over again. I'm speaking primarily of other conferences I have served in. Now, I want you to change just one item in this process, because this is the key of moving from culpability to creativity. And that is, I want you to replace contempt with curiosity. So bring that encounter back up. Now we're going to somewhat walk through this encounter. How would that encounter have changed if instead of holding the performance in contempt, you approach the performance curious that at any given time and in any given situation, we are doing the best we know how to do? So play that scenario out in your mind. Would that have changed anything? This is feed forward. It moves us from the position of culpability and shame to a position of compassion and creativity. And this is the key to my objective of moving you from a framework of culpability to a framework that utilizes reviews as points of creativity, resilience, and adaptiveness. And if I can replace this one item with curiosity, you will have moved from shame to creativity in your own thinking. And that's important, right? Because not only do you have to move yourself within your own thinking from culpability to curiosity, or from contempt to curiosity, you have to move your church in its culture from a culture of contempt to a culture of curiosity. And we'll delve into that a little bit. Again, I'm hoping that when Rob Boyle, we can get him to join with us, can delve into that a lot, because that really is his strong suit. So right now, we're going to hear two scenarios, a tale of two churches. I've asked Keiko Dinbo to read to us the scenario of First Church, UCC. If you want to follow along, I think this is on page 4 of the material that was sent out. So Keiko, if you'll please read that scenario for us.
A Tale of Two Church Cultures. First Church UCC recently called a new pastor without any clear understanding as to the purpose and goals of the congregation outside of a vague hope of growing. For the first bit, most folks are happy with the new pastor's ministry, but at some point, complaints begin to rise. Perhaps some folks feel they have been looked over pastorally, or that the pastor does not take interest in their social or theological concerns. While these complaints are listened to, they are essentially ignored, for they represent a small number of the total congregation. Over time, the people with the complaints began to feel alienated and become louder to assert their voice and point of view, which they understand is indicating real deficits in the pastor that is harming the church. These folks will also begin recruiting others to their point of view, particularly in face of an unyielding church leadership, yet another sign of the pastor's control. Eventually, to indicate that all voices are being heard, the leadership will call for a performance review of the pastor. During this evaluation, most of the pastor's strengths will be ignored as focus is placed on the complaints. The review emphasis then is placed on the pastor's personality and character, instead of asking what resources the pastor may need to perform the desired behavior at the heart of the complaints. Others in the congregation become resentful and form a pro-pastor coalition. The purpose of this coalition is not only to protect the pastor, but also to impugn the character of those set against the minister. Further entrenchment sets in, and voices on both sides get louder. Usually at this point, the conference office is called and asked to provide some type of mediation. This mediation typically takes the form of surveying the church members for the unspoken purpose of apportioning out judgment and blame for the conflict. An orientation is held on participating in difficult conversation, and mediated conversations are held. Both parties typically remain bitter, angry, and feeling justified in the actions they participated in.
Thank you for that, Kiko. Much appreciation. Keiko, may I borrow from your good graciousness and ask you to read the second scenario as well?
Absolutely. Holy
Thank you.
Mountain Church, UCC, has already called a new minister. During the time of the interim minister, they decided that they wanted to make youth a priority for the church. Specifically, they decided to focus on making the worship service more attractive to youth and young adults. The new pastor arrived and worked with church leaders to create a worship committee, which purpose was to research what youth and young adults were asking for in terms of a worship experience. This committee was composed of the pastor and music director, as well as youth and young adults and key lay members with a keen interest in worship. The committee spent time in reading material about the younger generations, visiting and talking with churches which had good youth and young adults attendance in worship, and they entered into discussions with youth and young adults in their community. Pulling their growing understanding together, the committee discerned the core purpose of worship was connecting and reconnecting. Youth and young adults want to feel reconnected to God, themselves, and their neighbors. The committee also made the decision that instead of starting a separate youth and young adults worship, a revamping of the primary worship service would take place. An underlying value of the church was for intergenerational spirituality. The committee committed to meeting weekly and asking these questions. What worked well in helping people feel connected to God, themselves, and their neighbor? What do we want to improve for next Sunday? What do we need in order to make these improvements? The committee also decided to include weekly feedback forms so that all members could be assured of an avenue for sharing their experience of the new service. The emphasis was to discern how they could improve the quality of connection. No anonymous comments were allowed, and the committee agreed to be in touch with every parishioner who raised a concern. While they could not guarantee that every concern would be met, they did guarantee that the wisdom behind every concern would be taken seriously and acted upon.
Thank you. I appreciate you reading those scenarios. So let's think through this. We've seen two different churches here act in ways that they felt were genuine to them, right? But they had two different drastic outcomes. So let's contrast the two. What was the focus of the review for First UCC? Somebody, you can unmute your mics here and just shout out your answer. What was the focus of First UCC?
Focus was on the past and what was done wrong.
Thank you. Kimberly, you're still in my fire, but thank you for that. I appreciate it. Yes, their time orientation was to the past. What was the time orientation of Holy Mountain? Where were they focused in terms of their time orientation?
Now and future.
Into the future, yes, yes. But what I meant by focus is, maybe I should have asked the question, who or what is the focus of the review for First UCC, and who or what is the focus of the review for Holy Mountain?
With the First Church UCC, the motivation to have the review was coming from a complaint. So it's in the way of looking at the past and the current performance of the pastor from a point of attaching culpability and blame, and when things are not going to a certain group's way. In the case of the Holy Mountain Church, you're looking at the ministry of the youth ministry that they wanted to build, and this was a joint effort, and so it was based a missional effort, and so it didn't deal with performance. It really dealt with a mission that they wanted to pursue as a group.
Thank you. I did not prime Kiko for these answers at all, but I have to admit that between Kimberly and Kiko, I appreciate where you all are at and how much you have already drunk in of the presentation here. You're absolutely right. First UCC is focused on an individual performance, right? And that performance is a past performance. Holy Mountain is focused on a goal. They have a goal that they want to live into, and so they're focused present and into the future. How do I ask this question? What is the goal of First UCC, or is there a goal for First UCC?
Well, this is Peter. So one of the things that I take note of is essentially First Church UCC had sown their own seeds for failure precisely because they didn't have any clear understanding as to the purpose or goals of the congregation outside of a vague hope of growing. That goes to the old corporate saw. If you don't make a plan, then you're planning to fail. So what they saw seems to me to have been inevitable.
Thank you. And Peter, if I may continue talking with you, contrast that with Holy Mountain. What had Holy Mountain done? How are they different?
So aligned with that notion of feed forward, they were in some ways opposite because they knew what their goals were and they made a plan to succeed as well as a plan around how to succeed.
Absolutely right. It was a well-defined goal, and they understood, and we'll get into this when we walk through the mutual ministry review template, what well-defined goals do for us. So thank you for that. What is the underlying culture in these two congregations?
My thought is, hi, David. First Church feels like they're just trying to survive, sort of a culture of survival. Whereas Holy Mountain, there's a culture of vitality and vibrancy. They're not just trying to survive.
Thank you. Yes, one is in a survival mode, and one is decided they're going to thrive, or at least attempt to thrive. Some of this we don't have control over. Writing a scenario, you have a little more control how things play out. But that truly is the difference in their cultures. What is the atmosphere? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, this is Doug. One of the things that I took notice is not sure if First Church had an interim pastor, but it is well noted that Holy Mountain did. So Holy Mountain had prepared themselves for the coming of a pastor by involving an interim pastor to help them get to the goals. So I think that is some of the culture. And also you can look at it as that maybe First Church was a smaller church with not many resources, and Holy Mountain Church was a larger church that had more resources. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Doug. I do appreciate the fact that you have mentioned what the role of an interim minister can be and do. So thank you for that. We've not given size to these churches, right? So part of what we read in there may be part of what we bring to that. So please be aware of that. Although I do appreciate the fact that smaller churches have a different path in front of them than medium and larger churches, which has a little bit more resources. So thank you for that as well, Doug. Much appreciated. One, right, it's this atmosphere of fear. We're failing. The other one has an atmosphere of adventure in it. We're going to branch out and do this or make this a go. One uses the review as a club to persuade the pastor, you got to do this. One uses the review to foster further discoveries on how they can better reach the goal they have set before them. So these are some of the differences between these two scenarios. So be aware of that the culture we bring with us does set for us some of the outcome, or as Peter said, we'll plant the seeds that we're going to be reaping somewhat of a crop of later on. So I do appreciate that. This is the background. I appreciate you giving some extra time to this. As I got into developing this workshop, I realized this may be really the more important part of the discussion than the template, because the template you have and you can walk through, and we'll still do that. So thank you for taking a little time here. It could be, and I want to mention this, well, it's not could be, when you do a mutual ministry review, as we're going to step through, you need to have a culture of curiosity and not a culture of contempt. If you do it out of a culture of contempt, it will fail, and it will fail spectacularly. The first time when I learned to do this, the first review I set up was a review on me and my senior. And we did this from an appreciative point of view, and we thought we had people understanding that. And the personnel committee gave us the data from a SWOT analysis. And a SWOT analysis is about weaknesses and threats. And it was awful, absolutely awful, because they took information that wasn't designed for that and they molded it into that. And so it will fail. So part of what we have to do as church leaders is to shift this paradigm within our church. And you have to do that before you do the mutual ministry review. Otherwise, the review is going to fail. And that's what I had not done appropriately in that particular setting. So you want to set up some conversations in the church, clear communications on the orientation of the review. It's going to be about the future and not about the past. You want to clarify the goals of the review. It's not going to be about punishment. It's going to be about creativity and resourcefulness. You want to embrace a sense of adventures with the ups and downs and have the church embrace that sense of adventure. And you want to prioritize discovery over status quo. That the purpose of this review is not the status quo of the church, but it's the discovery of things God is calling us to be better at, or to improve in, or develop into. I can't tell you how many reviews are set up for one purpose, and that is to enshrine the status quo of the church. Mutual ministry reviews don't do that. And if that is what the church is looking for, they'll be very disappointed in a mutual ministry review. We're here, it's time, we're at the end of Act 1, so it's time for an intermission. I'll stay here. If you have questions, I'll happy to do that. If you need to take a bio break, I'll go get something to drink or eat. I know we're cutting into some prime time for meal services. Feel free to do that. We'll be back, let's say, in 5 minutes. I have 5:43, so that would bring us back at 5:48. And then we'll walk through the mutual ministry review and the conduct accountability process. Thank you.
Hi, David. Dennis Alger calling from California.
Hi, Dennis.
Thank you for
there you
doing
are.
this.
Hey.
Thank you. Thank you for letting a freeloader get involved tonight. I'm appreciating this. We talked about this in inter-ministry training years ago, but I need to have you going through it again. It's really helpful to have your words behind the concepts, and so thank you.
Oh, appreciate you saying that, Dennis. Thank you for being here this evening.
Sure, glad to do it.
David, can you hear me? This is Jade Young.
Yes, Jade.
Hi, David. We haven't met before, but just want to briefly say hello. I'm with the Community Church of Honolulu, and I think a couple of our folks have met with you a few months back.
Yes, yes, they have. Yes, thank you.
I have a quick question for you, which is, do you and then the conference make yourselves available for churches in particular if they are seeking or wanting some kind of both resources and some guidance? I mean, I know you're providing this format now, but what if a church may want or feel there's value in having some more focused, time to meet?
Yes, this is right. This is the broad shot out across the conference, but
Right.
we are available, and I'm happy to be available for a local church if you believe this would be useful and you want kind of a contextualized training for your congregation. We're happy to provide that.
Okay, because I'm very familiar with the appreciative inquiry methodology, and I gather that this is sort of a tandem, appreciative way. So let me, I know how to reach you. You're at the conference office. So I just wanted to make sure that was available before I, would take the next step.
Thank you. I appreciate you asking that. And
Yes.
I meant to say that at the beginning and forgot.
Oh, okay. And I'm sure there are other churches too who
if there
could
are
find.
a church here, yeah.
Yeah, this is very, very valuable information. The context of looking for what's right rather than what's wrong.
Correct. And for some people like you, right, and others here, we've already heard it, they have that kind of background. They know some of the the pieces here. And I'm aware that for some other folks, this might be brand new information, and in that paradigm shift, that's a difficult shift to make. And so helping churches make that shift, I'm happy to be a part of that, or our staff here to be a part of that as needed.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
I'm reading the question in chat. Hits, I went silent. The question in chat, thank you, Becky, right? That's the $20 million question. How do you change the culture to from accountability to creativity, right? It's easier said than done. Lots of conversations is a part of that. But I do think the key to that is replacing contempt with curiosity. And that's where it begins. I have to change that culture within myself before I can begin to help other people change. It's like being on the airplane. You got to put the oxygen mask on yourself before helping your companion. Otherwise, it's not going to work out, right? And I'm hoping that when we can get Rob Boyle to come and lead us through a conversation on creating cultures of excellence, that paradigm shift is a part of what he brings with us. And I decided not to approach that too much tonight because that really is his kuleana, so to speak, and it's not so much mine, and I don't want to misstate. But if there were a church that is working on that and would like help with that, we could certainly be in conversation here in the conference office and have those type of conversations with individual congregations. We're happy to do that and map out some strategies around that for you, or with you, I should say. Well, let's go ahead and move on. Thank you all for coming back. That's always exciting. I always get concerned if you have a break and only 3 people come back. But anyway, thank you for returning. We're moving into Act 2, which is, we're going to walk through. So I'm going to ask you to pull up your documentation. We're on page 6 of the Mutual Ministry Review template. I have learned that when we explore this review template, we need to be clear about what we're reviewing. And this template is a broader review than the traditional review. The traditional review, what we looked at was what? The pastor's skill set. If we were progressive, we might have looked at the pastor's skill set in attitudes or values, right? Oh, we're so progressive. But what it boils down to, we're still looking at the pastor's performance, an individual performance, versus reviewing the entire organization or the entire congregation. So that's what I like us to think about ministry settings as a 3-legged stool, right? So you could be minus 1 leg and you'll be a bit precarious, but you could still probably balance that stool without too much problems. If you're minus 2 legs, the stool's unstable and will upset and in a heartbeat without any thinking about it. So that's one of the problems with the traditional review. It was a 1-legged stool. The Mutual Ministry Review is a 3-legged stool. And so we're going to look at goals. We're going to look at values. We haven't talked about them yet, but we will. And we're going to look at skills and abilities. We've already talked about that some. Those are the 3 legs that make the stool sustainable. So let's move on into this. The first thing you're going to notice is in this, let me also state just some underlying assumptions. I want to always be clear, these are the assumptions I bring into this, because I know other people have other assumptions and sometimes they clash. So I just want to be, yes, this is the assumption I'm moving in with. The ministry of the church is the responsibility of both the pastor and the congregation. That's a huge assumption of a mutual ministry review. The ministry is the responsible of both. The review works best when outlining expectations for attitude and behavior moving forward, as opposed to addressing problematic behavior. Now, I'm not stupid. I know that both ministers and church members can get into problematic behavior that we must address because they're hindrance to the ministry of the church. And that's what that accountability, conduct accountability process is about. So we'll look at that too. But reviews, that is not a review, that's an intervention. Reviews work best when talking about feed forward, as we have described it. This review looks best when there is low to moderate conflict in the congregation. We'll look at scaling the conflict a little later on. If you're at the deep end of the conflict, basically if you're calling the conference office saying, help us, ministry reviews are too late. Because we're actually at behavior intervention at that point. The church culture of the church is oriented toward creativity and not toward culpability. We talked about that. The pastor and congregational leaders are filling out the review at the same time so that everybody's being reviewed together. This template, of course, is just a template and can be modified and should be modified to fit the context of your local congregation. I don't believe in silver bullets that cover everybody's situation. This has to be contextual. So please be aware of that. Let's look at goals. Goals are articulate, or the way that we articulate our common desires about the future state of the church that we want. That is what a goal is about. We saw with Holy Mountain, their goal was for more youth and young adults in a singular intergenerational service. That was their goal. That's what they articulated. That's what we want to live into and grow into in our future. In this sense, goals have legs and they take us somewhere, right? And that somewhere should be to our future. If they take us to our past, that's not a goal, that's regression. So this hope of building a church that looks like something in the 1950s, that's not a goal, that's a regression. I think that's probably what First Church UCC got caught up in. They were regressing and not living forward into what God is calling them to be and become. Fictionally speaking, of course. So that's what goals do. Goals have two components we need to be aware of. They have an outcome, that's the why or the destination of the goal, the why of it and the destination of it. And goals have a process, that's the how of the goal or the path the goal takes us through. That's why we also need to talk about values to make sure that our goals do not disrupt the values that we hold dear. Because if they do, then the goals will be torpedoed, and rightfully so, because they're not honoring the values of the church. So goals have an outcome and they have a process to them. It's important that goals be stated in the positive, so you can form a picture of the desired future you want for your congregation in consciousness, right? Right now, we're as a culture, we are really in this thing around hate of the immigrant. And so I'm reading a lot of good and well-intentioned people. How do we create less hate in America? So I throw that out there for you to think through in your mind. How do you create less hate? I don't know. What does it mean if I'm hating somebody? What does it mean if I hate them less? I hate them 3 days out of 5? How do I grow less hate? I can't picture that in my mind. I can, though, picture how I can grow more love. I can see myself being kind and helping out and standing up and marching with and being in solidarity with. That I can picture. So goals must be stated in the positive. We can never grow less of something. Our minds can't picture that. We can grow more of something, or whatever the positive statement of that goal is. Remember the tale of the two churches. Holy Mountain UCC had a well-defined goal. First UCC was vague and fuzzy. And as Peter pointed out, that was part of the problem from the very beginning, right? Not when we got toward the end with the pastor, but from the very beginning, that was part of the problems. Here are questions that you would survey whoever is filling out the review. Here are the questions they would fill out. How will you know we have received this goal? So for an example, one of the goals of the Hawaii conference is missional giving or missional stewardship, missional stewardship. So how will we know when we have received that goal of missional stewardship as opposed to a routine of our controller and our accountant working within the MIT guidelines for CPAs? We got to figure that out. That's part of what we're trying to figure out. For Holy Mountain, they knew how they would get their goal, right? There are more young people, more youth and young adults sitting in the pews. That's an easy way to measure that goal. What mile markers are you aiming for along the way? So how will you know you're on track for this goal? So that's a question you need to ask. How will you know if you are off track for this goal? That's another question. What are the signs that we have gone down the wrong road to get to this goal? How will you check if you're on or off track? Who's in charge of this goal? And you're asking this, right, of the pastor and of the church, so that the church begins to understand, holy crap, we're responsible for this goal, aren't we? It's just not the pastor, it's us too. And it's just not the church leaders, it's me sitting in the pew too. That's part of the reason why you do this. You're asking them, what do you know about the goal? How are you involved in that goal? And then finally, what is your timeline for achieving this goal? Is this a short-term goal, a month, 2 months out? Is it annual goal? Our conference has a 10-year plan, so we got 10 years to get to these goals that we have set up. So that is the questions around goals. You want to frame them a little differently than they are framed here, because you may want to, if you know your goal, write your goal in there. How will we know when we achieved more butts in the pews? How will we know when we achieve whatever your goal is, more presence in the community? Whatever that goal is that you're looking for. You would actually name that goal and have your people really review that goal and their relationship to that goal. The pastor and the congregation reviewing that type of question. Then we get to values. Values are often the why, right? We talked about the two parts of the goal, the outcome, which is part of the why, and the process, which is part of the how. So values are often the why for the desired future we seek. In the case of the fictional church, Holy Mountain Church, the value of passing on the faith to the next generation was the impetus for setting the goal of increased youth and young adult attendance in worship, right? It wasn't, we're going to die and we need young people to keep us alive. It was, we value passing on the faith to the next generation. That's why that's the goal's outcome, passing on the faith, not more butts in the pew. But passing on the faith to the next generation also allowed them then to have a quality worship service or worship experience for youth and young adults. That's the process. That's the path they took to passing on the faith. We will meet the youth with a quality worship experience that is built for youth and young adults. That's the path we're going to take for the purpose of passing on the faith to the next generation. So that's how values play into this. If their value was more butts in the pew, It doesn't matter what they do with their worship services. The youth and young adult will still see the church as irrelevant because that's transactional. You want us in there for your survival. You have done nothing about the needs of my own soul. It's that simple, right? It's not that simple, but it is that simple, right? So here, the values not only generate the goal, but they also become the compass on the journey to the preferred future that our churches are heading to. One single worship service to allow for intergenerational spirituality. That's their goal, that's what they're working for, and that's what they're hopefully will achieve, right? So the path for Holy Mountain was not through a traditional service for the kupuna and a contemporary service for the youth and young adults. It was through that one intergenerational service, whatever that would mean to them. So we can see here the alignment between the values of Holy Mountain and the goals of Holy Mountain. We struggle with that in First UCC, right? They don't have a goal, which means they can never know when they're doing whatever they feel they should be doing. And it means that their values are never honored because there's no conversation around goals to lift up the conversation of values. Also, we need to note that the congregation and the pastor of Holy Mountain are in agreement on the values and the goals. A lot of pastor and congregational conflict, and I'm naming that particularly, pastor and congregational conflict, is a conflict over expectations of the pastor, and the underlying expectations are values. Does the pastor in the congregation hold in essence the same values or values the same goals? And if they don't, then we got some problems that we need to talk about and figure things out about. But notice that they are in agreement on the values. And again, First UCC, where there's confusion around a vague goal and probably little sense how it serves the congregation values outside of we don't want the church to die, which is not a value. That's a fear-driven thing because we don't want to disappoint God. And disappointment of God is based on a spirituality of fear off of law and not a spirituality of grace in which God says, you did your best and I honor that. So here I'm making a judgment system here on spiritualities, but that's where I find myself in this mix. Y'all can disagree and that's fine, but you know where at least I stand. So here are the questions then that we help to clarify the values that we would, if we're doing this in a survey, we would put these type of questions in that survey. And again, you may name individual values of your church. Here I didn't name them, I just used values generally speaking. What agreed upon values support this goal? Can they name those values? Are they agreed upon, right? What is the cost in time, money, and opportunity? And do we value this enough, right, to make that cost in time, money, and opportunity? That's a good question. What is important? I'm sorry, I'm down in the ecological benefits. Let me back up just a second here before we get to the ecological benefits. What are the agreed upon values? How will you be living this value in the process of achieving the goal? This becomes very important. Some people are the ends justify the means. That's a valueless system. If you can't live your values in achieving this goal, then that goal is not from God. That goal is from your own egos and maybe your collective ego, but it's not from God because God calls us to live our values. The kingdom of God and the values of the kingdom of God is what we are called to live as Christians. And if we are searching for a goal that calls us to abandon those values to achieve the goal, that's not a goal we should be shooting for. So please be aware of that. Then we get into the ecological benefits of the goal, right? What are the ethical consequences of achieving this goal for ourselves, for others? Are there negative consequences to that we need to be aware of? Because everything has both a negative and a positive and a negative consequence, right? In Hebrew, the word for curse and blessing is the same word, because what blesses somebody may wind up cursing somebody else, and we just need to be aware of that. What then, of course, is the cost and time, money, and opportunity, and are we willing to pay that cost? What is important in the present state of the church that must come with us to the desired future state of the church? Look at Holy Mountain Church. What was important was what? Intergenerational spirituality, passing that faith on to the next generation. And that is what moved them into the future and came with them in that scenario into the future. And that what is in the present state of the church that needs to be left behind? And right, you're not answering this question. Everybody that's being reviewed, right, surveyed for the review is answering this question. And you'll be able to see, are we aligning ourselves? Are we misaligning? If you're misaligned, then there's other conversations that needs to take place in the church to kind of get everybody on the same page, because maybe that's the rub. It's not so much the goals, but the values have become misaligned as we have worked to these goals or something of that nature. So what needs to come forward with us? That's the strength, right? What's our strengths and what needs to be left behind? And then finally, we also review around the abilities, right? Abilities and skills and the resources needed to achieve the goal. We're not asking the question, does this pastor preach a good sermon? Does this pastor lead a good Bible study? Does this pastor do pastoral care on a regular basis? We're not asking those questions. We already know the answer to those questions. We don't have to survey the congregation about that. That's a conduct of accountability piece. That's not a review. We're asking the question, what obstacles stop us from achieving this goal? And the pastor is answering that question too. Oh, when I look at that, I realize I'm not quite strong in. That's fine. When the congregation answer it, they may answer it, oh, when I answer that, I realize I'm not bought into whatever, however they may answer that question. And then the follow-up question, what is needed to address these obstacles, right? What resources, what abilities, what skills do we need? Do we have them in the church? Do we need to seek an outside consultant to help us develop them? Do we need to bring somebody in on staff? Or what is it that we need to help resolve these obstacles? So I'm going to stop here. That was a quick walkthrough, but any questions on goals, values, or abilities?
David, you have a question about, do you have any helpful hints on how to align all the people that need to be aligned if they're not there right now? So how do you align the pastors, the leaders, the members? So just, give the total answer.
Sarah, y'all already know this, so I'm going to confirm what your wisdom is already telling you. It's the things we do, and we do very well, to be honest, in the United Church of Christ. Small group discussions, possibly a sermon series from the pastor on these particular topics with buy-in from the congregation, that's going to be the sermon series. Having maybe some congregational meetings in which you raise these things up so that you're addressing this alignment piece. The very first step, though, and the UCC is not good at this, the very first step is acknowledging there's misalignment, right? We never want to acknowledge that we disagree with each other. We're great at disagreeing with each other, but we never want to acknowledge it for some reason. So that's part of the thing. A review might help raise up, and that will be a follow-up to the review. Wow, this church is all over the place. We're not in a place of unity around vision and purpose and understanding. And there are, there are resources that I do have available and can make available to you all to that around those type of conversations. But you start with that basic conversation. What's the basic conversation is, who is God to us? And that's a scary conversation, right? Because you're going to have, if you got 50 people in a church, you're going to have 100 answers to that question. But you begin by saying, who is God to us? How do we see God? How do we understand God's work in the world? And then the next question becomes, since we see God this way, what do we feel is our purpose in God's vision for the world? And you figure out whatever that purpose is. Generally speaking, and very large picture, it's to be a thumbprint of God in the community in which or community or communities that your church serves. That's a short answer, my short answer for that particular question. But you want to articulate it for your church, right? And then you move on to the questions around values. What values flow out of this purpose? What are our core values? And then you move on to that question about expectations. What the expectations for our staff or minister or our lay leaders, depending on who lead the church, and how do we help them, support them within those expectations. And then from there, you move out to your environment and your skill sets. Those type of questions. Where are we located? Are we located in the right place? Or what does our facility look like? Do we need to spruce it up? Those type of questions. What skills and abilities do we need to foster? Those type of questions. That's a short thing. If you want more conversations on that, just give me a call. I'm happy to do more conversations on that. And I do have some materials that I can share around that as well. Any other questions around goals, values, or abilities?
David, I had a question regarding goals, and you're always saying that we need to work with the congregation, but if we don't have these numbers to go to work with, how do we go about it?
Correct. Thank you for that. Understand, if you have 3 people meeting in worship of Jesus Christ, Jesus said, I'm there, and that's a congregation. And you just have that conversation among yourself. The smaller the church, the more informal these conversations become, right? Because you could just, well, we're in COVID, but once we're gathered back together and we're meeting in fellowship after church, we could just sit down in fellowship and kick this type of talk story, to use the language here from where I came from. We would say to kick this can around. That's rural Kentucky for you, kicking cans around. There's nothing else to do as a kid in rural Kentucky. I'll just put it that way. But anyway, you can do that just informally. You could just say, we're going to spend the next couple of Sundays kind of talking about our future. Let's dream a little bit. You don't necessarily have to go through the formal route, but you can use these type of questions as seed questions. And for a small church, I would say the question is, what's the one thing we want to accomplish this next year? The one thing that we're going to put all of our energy into for this next year. And that's what you work on for that year. Once you accomplish it, then you sit down and you say, okay, what's the one next thing we want to do? That would be the way for the smaller church. Absolutely. Again, a medium size and larger church with a little more resources and a little different way of organizing yourself, you'll probably want to be a little more formal with the process. That was a great question. Thank you for asking. Others, we're quickly running out of time. You'll see here a sample action plan. The goal of your survey, your review, is to draw up an action plan for the future, right? So I'm going to quickly pick up on a couple of these because I do want to get to the conduct accountability piece. So let's say your goal, this is on page, what, 8 of your document if you're following along. So let's say your goal is to increase revenue. You're going to find out who's responsible for that. Well, that's the finance committee. If you're in a small church, it could be just a stewardship chair, or it could be the pastor because there's nobody else, right? So you figure out who's responsible for that. You set that deadline by this we're going to say by the end of this fiscal year. What resources, right? Enrich stewardship ministry in the church, additional revenue streams coming into the church. Obstacles to that. Well, the pastor doesn't want to be known as always asking for money, so we're going to give the pastor permission to ask for money and make it understood that the pastor has that permission to the congregation, not just to the pastor, but to the congregation. We are undeveloped in stewardship leaders, or people are giving as much as they can. We are a poor church. And so what are the actions then to address these obstacles? Well, we can attend stewardship training events and implement 2 ideas from that event. We don't have to implement them all. 1 or 2 will do us. We will develop an unused portion of our facility for rental purposes or something of that nature. We will sell ice cream at a community event. You know, we will dream up these ways of meeting these obstacles. How do you measure that? How do you know when you receive this goal? Well, your revenues are up over last year. I pastored a church that had at a minimum an 11-year deficit budget. And I suspect had we had reports that went back before 11 years, we would have found a much longer deficit budget. I got blamed for that. Pastor, our budget this year is overspent. That's your fault. I got blamed for that. And then I found the 11-year report and found out, it ain't my fault. You've had 11 years of this. You can imagine the year when we broke even. I celebrated that like Jesus was coming back and coming back through our congregation, because that was absolutely huge that we turned around from a deficit budget and to, in fact, we were in November, we were $70 ahead of our budget. So I was going to have 70 celebration. Whatever we did, we were going to do in 70s. By the time we closed the books, we closed $203 ahead of 11 plus years of deficit spending. Beautiful, but you got to be strategic about it, right? The next one, we want a less boring sermon. You'll see that's in parentheses because you can't grow a less boring sermon. You can grow a vibrant worship service, right? But you can't grow a less boring sermon. So you state that in the positive. The pastor is a part of that. Worship leaders are part of that. The reality is the congregation's a part of that too. We're going to set that for 3 months out, right? This is a short-term goal. So we're going to maybe resources, right? Might be advanced communication seminars for the pastor, a liturgy review. I was a member of a church at one time, I kid you not, had a 15-page bulletin. Oh, the liturgy was a heavy weight. We could live with that because there were other things about the church that we like. But a liturgy review, maybe expansive musical expression, maybe remodel the sanctuary because the sanctuary is so dull. No matter what you do in it, it's just going to be dull too, right? You have to think through all of that. So obstacles, the adaptability of the pastor, the adaptability of the congregation to worship experimentation, funds for enhanced worship materials, actions that you could take, taking seminars, dialogue with members on what meaningful worship is, funds for enhanced worship materials, maybe funds for remodeling or at least a cleaning up of the sanctuary. So how do we know we have met this goal? The number of people grumbling about the worship service has decreased by 90%. So in hearing 20 people a month complain or a Sunday complain about the sermon, we now only hear 2. That's how you would measure that goal. You'll see the other things there. The last goal we were going to work through together, but we're pressing time. Scaling the conflict. Mutual ministry reviews do not work. across the board, and I need to emphasize that. If you think of a conflict scale as 1 to 7, 1 being virtually no conflict, 7 being we're bringing in torches and we're shooting arrows at each other, right? 1 to 3 is typically mild, and mutual ministry reviews work in that area of church life. So again, if your church is conflicted, mutual ministry review is not the path you want to go. If you're at a 4 to 5, that's a little heated. People are beginning to, be very opinionated about their position. This is where a conduct accountability process could probably be of help. And if the conflict de-escalates because of that, I would follow that up then with a mutual ministry review. If you are a 6 or 7 at that point, you're looking to outside mediators, and all of this is off limits, because when you're asked for outside mediators, it's a 70-30 split. 30% that you will work things out and the pastor will not be terminated, and a 70% chance that whatever happens, the pastor will be terminated or will resign. And what I noticed in the 30% that are successful in negotiating that type of conflict, it is because both the pastor and the congregation has been able to practice the spirituality of humility and to be humble in face of what's going on. And both sides have said, we have been wrong. What do we need to learn to live life together? That is why it's only 30%, because we got strong egos, both in our pulpits and in our pews, that often prevent that from happening. So be aware of that. Not the saying, don't give us a call, give us a call, but understand that what we've gone over tonight will not be helpful in that intense of conflict. So let's look at conduct accountability real quick here. Problematic behavior of pastors or problematic behaviors of individual church members. This could go either way. Cannot be handled through an annual evaluation, no matter how progressive or largesse or built on appreciative ways it is. It's not going to help. Such a move is tantamount to triangulating the congregation, or at least key members of the congregation, against the pastor. And I'm thinking primarily here the pastor. Rather, when leaders of a congregation deem a pastor's behavior, this can also be if there's a problematic member of the church, a pastor's behavior is proving problematic. What is needed is an intervention with the pastor. Reviews and evaluations will not resolve this issue. An intervention does not mean harsh treatment. That's not what we're after. We're not after culpability, blame, and shame. Rather, it means church leaders and the pastors are involved in a conversation directed at the behavior that is perceived as problematic, while the issues are still moderate within the congregation, and the best of the pastor is still hoped for, or is in purview, if you would. So I'm going to use an example that does not come out of the Hawaii conference. Again, comes out of another setting that I was in. From an appreciative way perspective, such a conversation would include these types of questions that we're going to go over to the pastor. And again, if you have a problematic person within the congregation, you can adapt this for those purposes too. So, right, what's our two underlying things? A person in any given time, is in any given situation, is doing the best they know how to in that situation. And the second one is shame leads to blame, and blame does what? It shuts people down, and we're not going to get from them what we would hope to get from them, right? A dialogue partner to change future performance. So that still maintains here. In another conference that I worked with, we had a pastor who was terminated for yelling at the church secretary. Not on one occasion, but not on 2 occasions, but on a number of occasions. So that's the scenario we're going to be dealing with as we work through this. The pastor was told by the church council, our secretary is not performing as we had hoped, and we want you, pastor, her supervisor, to fix that problem, right? Well, we already see we come from contempt instead of curiosity. This particular pastor, unfortunately, his background was as a parole officer. So how does a parole officer fix wayward parolees, right? By being tough. We can already see this isn't going to work out. So the pastor was terminated. And I was called in, right? For the night they terminated the pastor. I wasn't even aware they were doing that. I was called in. We're going to have a conversation. Please be there. It'll be a difficult conversation. The next thing I know, they're saying, so we chose him to terminate you. So it can get rough. I'm not sure this would have turned out differently because I think there was a lot of issues there. I'm not sure we could have worked through them all, but it would have been a different conversation had we asked these questions. What are you trying to achieve when you did this? It would have been nice, I think, for the church leadership to hear, I was trying to do what the church council had asked me to do, fix the problem, right? And then it would have been nice to have a whole conversation about why do we see people as problems and not as resources within our system. But that's a whole nother thing there. The follow-up question is, what other choices do you have? Again, that's looking forward. If this happens again, what other choices do you have? Besides yelling at her, how else might you, quote, fix the problem? And that is the questions around desired states that you would have. The other questions about underlying values, right? What are you hoping to get from this behavior? Well, I'm hoping to prove I'm the boss of the office here. Is that important that you prove you're the boss? I mean, those are good conversations. What is the reason that is important to you, right? So you're trying to help the person understand the impetus for that behavior and how it fits or does not fit. In this case, it does not fit because we're doing an intervention within the life of the congregation. Questions of ecology. What are you willing to give up in order to accomplish this? So I would ask my friend, so if you want to be the boss of your office, which was him and the secretary, is not a large office, you want to be the boss of that, what are you willing to give up so that you're the type of boss this church honors, right? What are you unwilling to change? What's your core values? And does that go against the expectations, the values of the church? What is good about the present situation? Is there something good? Is it all bad? We need to unpack that. If you find out what is good, that's the strength that needs to come forward with them. Then there are questions around ability, right? What can you learn from this? What will you do differently going forward? What could be stopping you from taking this action? You know what? I learned to lead by being a parole officer. Maybe I need to take classes in business administration from an appreciative inquiry point of view or something like that. In this case, after the guy was terminated and we worked with him, he went on and took classes in nonviolent communication and just really turned the trajectory of his ministry around due to that. Now, that wasn't because I asked him, what can you do differently? That was just us kind of fumbling around, figuring out what next steps for him were, right? And then finally, questions to shift the thinking patterns, because that's shifting the culture within that individual. What is the worst thing that could happen if you continue to do this? You know, we already know people are going to hate you. You're going to get terminated. What is the best thing that could happen if you did this? Or what is the worst thing that could happen if you don't do this? And what is the best thing that can happen if you don't do this? That's the type of intervention from an appreciative point of view that points us to the future. It doesn't mean we'll resolve everything, because in this type of intervention, we may find misaligned values that cannot become aligned. But that then allows us to part with dignity instead of seeing each other as the enemy. In the church, limping off going, well, we hate that pastor and we hate all pastors and we'll never trust pastors again. And the pastor limping off going, I hate ministry. I'm going to go into secular work. And we lose a brilliant pastor that has been honoring a call from God, right? Because of the way that we handle that. So that's an intervention. And again, you draw up an action plan. And what I want to make sure is that often, particularly medium-sized and larger churches, but sometimes smaller churches as well, you have personnel handbooks or something within your bylaws that might outline how you deal with this, and you have to be within your bylaws and those protocols. So whatever they are, make sure you're within them. But basically, an action plan contains these three statements. I behaved this way in the past in order to, and you write that out. I will behave this way in the future in order to, and you write that out. And if I do not behave as agreed, then I will face these consequences, and you write that out. So there's clear, solid understanding as to what is at stake and where that pivotal point is expected to take place within the thinking pattern of either the pastor, or if you're working with a problematic member of the church, within their behavior as well. And that's the conduct accountability process. And again, it is an intervention. This is for mild conflict, not for high conflict, because by then the pastor's just going to flip you off anyway, and you're going to flip the pastor off, because that's what conflict does to us. So there we go. We're a little bit past our time. So questions around, we'll just take questions on the accountability piece. Thank you. Cal has put in chat, and I totally agree. I'll read what she put in chat. It seems to me that it would be good to I'm sorry, I'm getting my tongue twisted. It seems to me that it would be good at the start of a pastor, absolutely, congregation relationship. It would be wise to engage in the values and goals conversations. Relying on what was written on the church profile, what was said in the search committee and church council interviews might mean that not everyone is on the same page despite the excitement of the new relationship. You're absolutely right, Cal. Thank you for lifting that up, and thank you for putting it in writing as well. The last local congregation that I served was a congregation of 40 people. Half the council was also the search committee, right? Because those were the active people in the church. And I was there, let's see, I entered the church in October. I had a very clear sense of the goals and the direction the search committee wanted me to go to. And in June, I looked at the council and I said, did you all ever talk to each other? Because the direction the search committee gave me and the direction the council is giving me are two different directions. And we spent the next 5 years figuring out what direction the church was moving into. And then I had 3 years of what I think is exciting ministry there, because we were cooking. We were in agreement and we were cooking in the right direction. So thank you, Cal, for raising that up. This goes back to what Doug pointed out, that important piece of interim work to help set up these conversations. But it's important for the church or the entity to continue those conversations as the new pastor steps in as well, so that that communications is going. Thank you for that. Any other, I've been asking for questions. I should have been asking any other mana'o, wisdom, or insights, because you all have them as well. This has been a conversation, or as close to one as we could get. So anything for the good of the group before we do a closing prayer? All right, well, thank you. This has been recorded, so it'll be put up on the Hawaii Conference website. If you want to return to this, you can always give me a call. I'm happy. These are the type of conversation. I'm such a geek that really get me excited, right? So feel free to give me a call. I'm happy to have conversations if the church is looking to set up something, to have those conversations as well, to strategize around setting these things up. So thank you for your time this afternoon and into early evening. Much appreciated. It tells me so much about your commitment to both your congregation and to the God that has called us into salvation and into forgiveness and into the work of Christ in this world as well. So thank you. You warm a very pessimistic heart from time to time. So thank you for warming my heart this evening. I've asked, and Doug Wooten has agreed to close us in prayer. So Doug, if you'll bring our closing prayer, please.
Thank you, David, for the invitation to give the closing prayer. And thank you for this valuable information that you've shared with us this evening. It has been a valuable time that we have spent together. I do want to say that as you were telling your story about the pastor that was yelling at the church secretary and his prior profession as a parole officer, and he got fired, I began to think, I said, oh my goodness, I better be careful. You wouldn't understand that unless you knew that I've spent 30 years in law enforcement myself, but I've never yelled at my secretary. So let us bow our heads in prayer. God, we come thanking you. We just thank you, God, for this time that you've allowed us to come and sit and hear the words that you have sent to our conference minister to share with us. We thank you, O God, for the wisdom that has gone forth on this day. And we pray, O God, that you would continue to bless us with your wisdom, continue to lead and guide us, O God, as we continue to attempt to lead and guide your people. Oh God, we realize that we have erred in some ways, but oh God, we know that your grace and we know that your mercy is sufficient. And we ask, oh God, that you grant us grace, and we ask that you grant us mercy. And now, God, as we go from our labor on this day into the refreshments of our evening, we ask, oh God, that you bless us, that we can be a blessing to others. Oh God, we thank you again for all that you have allowed us to witness on this day. And we pray, oh God, that you would give us rest, that as we move forth into the days coming. Thank you again, oh God. These and all blessings we ask in your son Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all. Aloha and blessings on your evening.
Aloha.
Thank you, David. That was good.
Thank you. Thank you.